Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Today we've got a great show. We have someone who's very familiar to the Ducks Unlimited audience. Obviously, if you read the magazine, the shotgunning column is one of the most important things that we do, one of the most popular. Today I have Phil Bourjaily on the line. Phil, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thank you for having me.
All right. Well, Phil's written so much for the magazine, and obviously, Phil also works for Field and Stream as well. A lot of our listeners have probably read him there. But one thing that we're talking about this time of year, and we do it every year, we usually have something in the magazine, either it's a column or a feature, but we're talking about off-season shotgunning tips, ways to get better in the off-season. And what we're going to do today is we're just going to walk through an old feature that Phil did for the magazine, and it's off-season shooting tips for waterfowlers. And some of these are basic tips, but these are things that you can do right now that will improve your shooting later in the season. So, Phil, the first thing that, on your list of the top, 20 or so things is cleaning your gun. How many people do you know really spend a significant amount of time cleaning their gun?
I can't say. Usually I do. I always used to say that if I wrote one column a year, it would be called Clean Your Gun. Because that's the most important thing, to keep it working, keep it in good condition. I've seen so many people who will take a gun out of a case that's been sitting in all winter and all summer, and it's the gun is orange from rust because they put a damp gun away and zipped it up in a airtight, watertight case. So it's important to go over it and give it that postseason cleaning and be real thorough about it. And if you've had any problems with the gun, it's a good time to take it to a gunsmith too.
Yeah, that's a good point. I can't say that I've never done that, but I did it once when I was young, probably in my teens, and opened the case a few weeks after the season ended and realized that I was going to have to come out of pocket for some money because this thing was a mess. And, one thing in your column you mentioned, removing the choke tube. That's something that a lot of people forget to do. Kind of speak to the importance of the choke tube and in the cleaning process.
Well, a few different things. And one is, if you don't take your choke tube out and clean the threads and re-grease it and put it back in, you might find yourself stuck with a fixed choke gun. I've done that. I learned that the hard way. Fortunately, it was with a trap gun, which I got a full choke stuck in it, which is all right because that's all I ever used. But especially if a gun gets wet, you can have a tube rust into the gun, and once it's rusted in, they don't come out. Mm-hmm. And it's expensive process to have it taken out. A lot of times you'll ruin the tube. Actually, I bought a gun. I bought a used turkey gun at a local gun store, and I know now I was asked to check, see if the tube will come out, and it wouldn't, and so they knocked about $75 off the price of the gun because the guy at the counter couldn't do it, the gunsmith couldn't get it loose, and finally they just said, if you still want it, we'll give it to you for even less money. But yeah, they get stuck in and they don't come out, and it's not cheap and it's not easy to get them out. So make sure you take it out, and snug it back in. It doesn't have to be cranked down tight, but get it in there snugly, because the other thing that can happen is if you get too much fouling building up underneath the skirts of the tube, especially if there's a little gap in there, you can get enough stuff under the tube that it'll kind of, I saw this happen once on the trap field this year. You get a wad can snag in it, and the whole tube can just peel. And then that's also how you can launch a tube downrange. So yeah, take care of your choke tubes.
That is a very good point, and that's something that I think duck hunters especially really should pay attention to, with the moisture, the mud, different things like that. And I've known people who have had that problem.
Yeah, well, it's easy to do. All you need to do is not do anything.
Number 2 on your list here is check your point of impact. And I know you've written specific columns about this, but why don't you just expand a little bit on the process of checking your point of impact?
Well, there's 2 different things you can check when you pattern to see where your gun shoots. And one is whether the gun shoots straight. And that you need to do from a rest and actually aim it as if you were shooting at a rifle or shooting at a turkey or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And just make sure that it actually shoots where it's pointed. And if it's way off, then it's a job for a gunsmith or a gun that you need to send back to the manufacturer to have made right one way or another. Because that's not a gun fit problem. If a gun doesn't shoot where it's aimed, that's not a fit problem. That's a gun problem.
Yeah.
The fit problem comes in. That's more, how the gun, fits you and whether it does shoot where you look. And that's the second thing you want to check. Once you make sure your gun shoots straight, then you take it. It can be as simple as just to put a golf tee in a dirt bank or whatever. Steel pattern plate works. A bed sheet works really well, so you can hang it up. And you mount the gun and shoot it. Do it 5 or 6 times without ever correcting. If you're off, don't ever correct, because you want to see where the gun shoots relative to where you look. And then from there, if it's not shooting where you're looking, then it's time to adjust the fit of the gun, with the shim kit that came with your gun, if it came with shims, or through bending the stock or adding height or some other way.
And that's all part of, this off-season process. Is, people taking guns either right out of the box or it's something they've always shot and maybe they're terrible shots. It's something you can learn. It may be the gun. I mean, that's the reality of using a tool such as a firearm. There's potential that it could be the gun. You may not be a terrible shot.
Yeah, it's usually you, but yeah, sometimes it is the gun.
Yeah, no, that's great. And let's not confuse checking your point of impact with patterning, which is the number 3 thing on your list. Patterning is a much, much different process. And again, this is something that you've written columns about. People can find these columns on ducks.org and how to do it. But the off season is the time to pattern. Let's go ahead and kind of explain and walk people through that process, because I know for a fact there's a lot of duck hunters out there who have probably never patterned their shotgun.
Right. Once you know where your gun shoots and you know that it fits you and all that we talked about before, you want to get an idea of what your hunting load and choke and gun do at various ranges. And, the standard is you shoot it at 40 yards, which is okay if you shoot your ducks and geese at 40 yards. But really what you want to know is what your gun is doing at the range you shoot your birds. So, anything you do with a gun that shows you, lets you learn more about how it shoots is great. So 40-yard patterns are okay, but so are 30-yard patterns if you're a timber hunter, so are 20-yard patterns. If you're a pass shooter, you want to shoot 50 and 55-yard patterns and really get an idea of how the gun is performing at the ranges that you use it. What I look for when I pattern a gun, I want a pattern that is spread across about 30 inches. The nature of patterns is that they are all denser in the center than they are on the edges. Mm-hmm. You don't want it overly dense in the middle. You don't want to tear birds up, and you want enough pellets in that outer between the 20 and 30 inches to give you a good chance to hit the bird if you mispoint the gun a little bit. So what you want is when people talk about even patterns, it's a pattern that's spread across that 30-inch circle is what you really want. That's what gives you the margin for error to hit the target. You don't need to concern yourself with percentages if you don't want. If I'm shooting at big ducks, I want about 100 pellets in a circle, in a 30-inch circle. That's enough. Geese, it's less because geese are bigger, maybe 70, and so on. You can percentages are fun to figure out too if if you enjoy fooling with counting holes and fooling with calculators, but you don't have to do it.
Yeah, and it's something that you mentioned in the column or in this feature here is that different waterfowl loads will pattern differently. So if you walk up and you're shooting a specific load that you just had in the garage, you're shooting that during the off season, that may not be doing you any good because you want to shoot the loads that you're going to shoot at ducks during the season. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, there's a big difference. Change shot size, change velocity. As a rule of thumb, the faster you drive a pellet, the more open the pattern is going to be. You can compensate for that with choke. As a rule of thumb, the bigger the shot, usually the tighter it patterns. So I tend to like big slow shot if I want to shoot a tight pattern. That's not everybody's preference, but yeah, there's lots of variables. And the only way to really know is to shoot the loads in the gun and the choke that you're going to shoot.
Yeah, and those variables, I just want to stress to, our audience out there, those variables are going to change, kind of like Phil explained. What kind of birds you're hunting? Are you shooting at teal? Are you shooting at geese? Are you shooting high snow geese? Are you shooting, low Canada geese? All those variables should be taken into account when you're patterning for a specific load for a specific hunt. But I just wanted to make sure that everyone understood that.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
Now, the next thing that you have on the list here is learning to aim below the target. And this it comes from your high level of understanding and target shooting. Am I correct in saying that?
It was something that I learned on the target range.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, we're all taught when we start to blot the bird out with the gun. Paint the bird out of the sky is what my dad always used to tell me. As soon as you cover the bird with the muzzle of the gun, you can't see the bird anymore. And once that happens, your eye goes to the gun. And when your eye goes to the gun stops. And it's a cause of a lot of mysterious misses. But if you're moving the gun, as you move the gun to the bird, if you're keeping it below the target so the target is in view, you can see where the gun needs to go and put it there. And I learned this, I think it was Anthony Matteries Jr., the sporting clay shooter, is also a terrific waterfowl shot. Watched me shoot at some clinic one time and said, just hold the gun a little bit below the target. And all of a sudden I started hitting a target I was having trouble with. And I always remember that, and I always try to do that now. But as long as you can see the bird, your eyes will send the hands to the right place. As soon as you can't, then there's trouble. Yeah,
that's a very important tip that I'm sure a lot of waterfowl hunters probably have never really thought through as the process unfolds from, decoying bird to, gun mount and the whole process. Learning to aim below that bird is very important aspect of it that a lot of people probably overlook. Now, number 5 is learning to trust and not measure. Can you explain what that means as far as shotgunning?
And I'm talking specifically about lead. Once you start trying to measure leads consciously, that's when you see eyes start to go back and forth between the target and the barrel. And if your focus isn't 100% on the bird, as soon as your eyes go to the gun, it stops. That's what people always say, don't stop your swing. But that's almost, it's more of a symptom. It's a symptom of looking at the gun, which is the root cause of it. As long as your eyes are out there on the bird, they're in the right place. You want the bird to be sharp and the barrels to be fuzzy. So you can't really measure a lead. You can approximate it and you can see a gap. And the more you do it, obviously the more memories you have, more built-in muscle memory you have, you'll know when it feels right. But it is you need to trust your eyes and hands to put the gun out where it needs to be. And when we talked about patterning, I mentioned a 30-inch circle. That's your margin for error.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to lead a bird by a certain number of feet and inches to hit it. You've got a 3-foot wide pattern, of which especially that center 20 inches is really dense, and that's the part that really kills birds cleanly. That's your margin for error. You can be, as long as you're on the right line, on the bird's line of flight, you've got some leeway in your in how much lead you put on the bird. So trust your eyes and hands, trust yourself. You've done this before. You've made these shots before. You just have to, when it feels right, you shoot. If you start to think about how far you're leading the bird, what will happen is you'll look at the gun, you'll think you were in front when you pulled the trigger and you were behind. It's a mysterious miss, but that's exactly what happened. You look back at the gun, the last thing you remember seeing was the gun in front of the bird. But as soon as you looked at the gun, the bird passed it. And I don't know how many times that's happened to me and how many times it happens to people I've shot with, but they'll say, how could I miss that? I was way in front of it. And no, you weren't. You were behind it. And that's because you looked at your gun and you were measuring a lead.
No, that's a good point. And I think as part of this process, as you learn to trust and not measure, relying on your hands and eyes too, make those movements and successfully hit the target. That's also something that comes from doing it on a regular basis, shooting more often. And would you agree with that? Just, the more you shoot, the more comfortable you're going to be, obviously.
Absolutely. Then the more it's no different than being a quarterback who throws pass to a receiver. They don't think about how far they need to lead. And that's a pretty complex equation because there's all kinds of stuff going on there, but they don't think about that. They've done it so many times, they throw the ball where it needs to go.
Yeah.
And that's, this is the same thing. This is easier and nobody's going to hit you.
That's right.
But it's exactly the same thing. You trust your own experience, trust your eye-hand coordination to do the job for you. They can do it a lot better. Your subconscious mind can do it a lot better than your conscious mind can.
Yeah, that is a great little tip. The next one on the list is lose the bead or supersize it. And I see this as being one of these things that is probably very specific to each shooter. Also comes with probably repetition in shooting, but kind of explain the process of either lose the bead or make it larger.
Well, the bead is there not to be looked at. What it's there to do is to show you where the gun is in your peripheral vision. So for some people, those big bright fiber optic beads are a help because they're not looking for the gun out of the corner of their eye as to wondering where it is. For other people, they're a distraction if they're pulling their eyes away from the target to the gun. So you use the one or tiny. There's a lot of sporting clay shooters now. The trend is they'll take the middle bead from their gun and they'll put it on the front. But it's whatever doesn't distract you from the target. So for some people, that's no bead at all. I can't shoot that way. I've tried it. For some people, it's a great big bright bead that lets them know where the gun is, even though they're looking at the target. Because we talk about 100% focus on the target, but in reality, you always know where the gun is. Mm-hmm. You have to. And so it's just a case, personal preference and personal shooting style and what allows you to put your focus on the bird. It's easy enough to experiment with it because beads, on most guns, except for the very least expensive guns, you can, those beads are staked in, but most are screwed in. And you can take a bead out and you can experiment with a different one or experiment with no bead. And if it doesn't work for you, you can put a bead back in.
Yeah, and that's something for people to look at and spend the time this time of year. It's the off season. Figure out if that bead works for you or if it doesn't, and test at this time, not during duck season. You don't want to be going back and forth from having a bead to kind of switching back and forth during the season. You want to learn that now. And this next one that you mentioned it's a very basic, but it's something that really is targeted towards, waterfowl hunters specifically. Adding a pad. Kind of explain what the benefits of adding that pad.
There's two things a pad does for you. And the first is it can reduce recoil. And that's often a concern. And there are some really, really good aftermarket pads available that do a good job of softening the blow against your shoulder. And also, there's different shapes of pads too. Not everybody's shoulder fits the pad that comes with the gun. So you might want a different shape that you'll find makes fuller contact with your shoulder. And so there's not kind of a hot spot of recoil where the gun digs in. So there are a couple different ways that a pad can help reduce recoil. And then the other thing that it can do is help you with your gun fit. Because obviously when you change pads, change thicknesses of pads or add spacers or length to your stock or whatever, or shorten the stock, you're changing the fit of the gun. And a lot of guns now come with spacers with the pads, which is a great deal because then not only do you not have to have a gunsmith work on your gun, but you can lengthen or shorten the pad depending on whether it's teal season and you're wearing a t-shirt or whether it's late in the waterfowl season when you're all bundled up and you want a shorter length pull so you don't hang the gun up on your jacket when you mount it. So those are the advantages of adding a pad. And anything you do to your gun, it's better not to do it during the season. You don't. get all those adjustments done and forget that. I was talking to a guy who's related at Bourjaily Manufacturing the other day about adjustable combs. He said there's two great things about it. The great thing about adjustable combs is they come with a wrench. The bad thing about adjustable combs is they come with a wrench. That is meaning that you can just fiddle with it all the time, and that's what we don't want to be doing with our gun, especially during hunting season. You want it set, you want everything done so that you can practice that gun and be confident with it and not be thinking, is my gun the problem when you're hunting?
Phil, I really appreciate you joining me today, and we're going to have you back on. We're going to go through more lessons, different tips and different tactics for off-season shotgunning. But thanks a lot for joining me. I really appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to thank Phil Bourjaily, Ducks Unlimited Magazine shotgunning columnist, for joining us today and providing all this information. I'd like to thank Clay Baird, our producer, for putting together the podcast and getting it out to all of you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for supporting the DU podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.